Castle Dimitrescu, one of the most intriguing locations before release, a structure that draws your attention from the second you step into the game's world, a level that greatly draws influence from previous iconic mansion-esque levels, and home to the tall woman herself. With all this, it's understandable why so many people got excited at the opportunity to explore such an extravagant and mysterious location. My excitement for the castle was so great it overrode any interest in the village itself, which at the time didn't really feel all that special or interesting to me. It was all uphill from there. We got more looks of the place, we met new enemies that already put Seven's line up to shame, and we got more of that tall woman that made everyone collectively interested in a Resident Evil game for once. It was a really exciting time. Top that off with the made and timed castle demos that gave us a taste of what's to come, and I was already making multiple accounts just so I could play that demo over and over and over until the game was released. So now that the game is released, what is my takeaway from one of the most attention-grabbing areas of the game? Well, I'll be going through and analyzing the castle's level design from the map, enemies, bosses, traversals, and puzzles. All the while I'll be giving my thoughts on what it gets right, wrong, or if it barely misses the mark. Analyzing story and characters is not my goal here, and I'll also try to reduce any comparisons to other games in this series, where you're only looking at this level in this game alone. But expect this rule to be broken once or twice. It's inevitable with how far the influence spans with this area. This deep dive will be from the perspective of my experience on hardcore, meaning a good chunk of the challenge I'll be discussing won't translate well to the lower difficulties in Village of Shadows. Well, now that this stage is set, let's finally enter the survival horror. It's a no-brainer that the atmosphere in Resident Evil Village is amazing, near perfect. It's hard to deny that. And while the atmosphere goes a lot into the design of a level, I am not going to be focusing on it too much outside of this section, because once you enter the castle, there's no clear objective outside of maybe my daughters here. No key items to pick up, no enemies, just seemingly nothing of importance. Just off of this alone, it's clear that the game is prioritizing setting the mood of this radically different location compared to the dirty village from before. Overall, these opening moments are very effective, not just through the visuals, but from the constant build-up and beautiful yet haunting design of the castle. This difference alone between this impressively crafted structure and a village on the brink of collapse is what helps you become aware of the great power dynamic at play here. No matter what happens to that village, it's going to be nothing compared to whatever wanders the halls of that castle. If the castle bells controlling the Lycan Horde and Elena's warnings didn't really tip you off to the dangerousness of this place, then walking through the castle vineyard will. Here we see corpses being used as scarecrows, something that the village also used. This tells us that despite this location's appearance, on the inside there's something a lot more sinister at play. The feeling of uncertainty that this creates is pushed further with our introduction to the Duke. The Duke is the merchant of the game. He sets up shop in safe rooms where you could buy, sell, and upgrade weapons. He provides other services, but since we're only focusing on the castle, we'll only focus on these three services. That means no cooking. He has a fun and charming personality with a hint of mystery to make you wary of his allegiances, and the way that he's used in the story really makes him more than a walking, talking grocery store. He's a joy to have around this overall dark and depressing setting, and can really create an atmosphere of safety in the safe rooms where he resides. The first of his services is the Duke's Purse, where you could sell anything in your suitcase. The way you sell stuff is through selecting a quantity of whatever item you have. It's very intuitive and helps prevent accidental selling, though items with high quantities like handgun ammo do take a while to select their maximum since there isn't an option to immediately select the highest quantity of an item. It's not a big problem, but it is noticeable. Up next is the gunsmithy, where you could spend money to upgrade weapons in the usual 4 categories. In the castle, you only have the option to upgrade each of these categories once, since it helps balance the enemies by still keeping them strong enough to be a threat, which is something a level like this needs to maintain. There's also the mechanic where upgrading ammo capacity refills your weapon with ammo. While overlooked by most, it's just a small mechanic that could really influence your choice of upgrades, especially on higher difficulties where you're unloading clips just to kill a single enemy. Finally, we have supplies, where you spend money for consumables, crafting recipes, weapon attachments, and upgrading your suitcase. These items are definitely worth your attention and helps incentivize seeking out treasures and money. With more knowledge of the game and on higher difficulties, buying and upgrading in general really become more engaging with greater importance on your resources and what upgrades you possess. Some of the best examples of this are to straight up neglect seemingly important upgrades or items because you know you won't need them in the future. One of the biggest worries I initially had was ammo being sold, but luckily the game seemingly knew that this idea would take away a lot of the hard decision making with this mechanic, because not only is ammo in small supply before being sold out, but the amount they cost is better used elsewhere. So overall, the Duke in the Shop is a welcome addition that really helps maintain the compelling decision making and exploration of an RE game, despite how limited upgrades and items are in this area. After meeting the Duke, we finally get our first taste at Castle Dimitrescu with the entrance hall. The difference between the village and this one room is just perfect, kind of feeling like you stepped into a different world. And while there's no clear objective outside of, well, find your daughter, there's a lot to take in, from the block-off doors and elevators for you to remember, hidden treasures on the wall, foreshadowing of the mini-bosses, gaining access to the safe room, and the notes that make you pretty wary of the Duke. This gives you a lot to remember before fully exploring the castle, while also being absorbed by the atmosphere. After a short trek through the left hallway, we appear in the Hall of the Four, one of our main hubs of the castle, both introducing us to the safe room and our eventual objective. After a creepy scream and a look at one of the doors in the hall, we are introduced to the Dimitrescu daughters, and it's not long after they drag us through a few rooms to meet the lady of the castle. What's there to say about Bela Dimitrescu and her daughters? I'll get to them as enemies later, but for now they're just a bunch of well-designed characters despite some of their small screen time. While a lot find their attractiveness overrides their potential scariness, I don't think that kind of scary is what the game was going for. Despite their appearance and very sexualized performance, the secret behind the daughters give them enough edge to find a sense of unease to their performance. The same goes for Alcina herself, but it's not as effective as her daughter, since her fear comes from her intimidation and commanding presence. This whole dissociation between beauty and grotesque is reflective in the overall appearance of the castle and its many rooms. On top of that, there's just enough detail put into each of the daughters' performances to make them very unique and endearing despite their childlike demeanor. Alcina Dimitrescu herself obviously steals the show in terms of presentation, with her fancy and proper exterior reflecting her mannerisms as a noble, while her more commanding presence being reflected in her obvious size. We also get more depth out of her character the more we ruin her livelihood, getting signs of both a loving mother in her own twisted way, while being the very entitled, petty, and prideful older sibling of the lords. This doesn't necessarily push the sympathy angle onto you, but it lets you make your own conclusion, which I think is a great way to expand on all the lords without drowning you with information. After abusing your hands, we're put in another fairly easy and linear escape from the rooms you're locked within. There's treasures, interactable pictures, and a lock drawer that further incentivize memorization of the layout of the mansion, which you've already experienced with the elevator and locked doors from before. You escape through the fireplace into a hidden passage in between the walls, which is another hint that there's more to this place beyond its beautiful exteriors. This is where you get the Maroon Eye ring, which opens up a secret door back into the hallway where the daughters dragged you. This ring is the first in a fairly linear set of key items you acquire in the first half of this area, which I will talk about later. I find that there's a missed opportunity in the use of secret passages in the walls, specifically for exploration and places to escape to, because after the wall that held the ring opens up and you enter the hallway, it closes, never to be used again. You can unlock the door back into the rooms where you escaped from while grabbing a few consumables and treasures on the way before returning to the Hall of the Four. Here is where we get a good look at our soon-to-be main objective, 4 busts with 4 missing masks to place them in. We don't know where the door that they open leads to, but it does give us an incentive to locate the halls that contain these masks. Returning back to the save room also establishes the Duke's merchant teleportation technique, which helps give the save room a greater sense of safety. I like it. Also inside the save rooms is an introduction to the labyrinths. These mini-games involve a special ball in the areas they're located in. It's a good incentive for the further exploration of the now opened up castle. With the giant door opposite to the angel mask door open, we're introduced to our other main hub, the main hall. It's an extravagant location with multiple doors, promising a huge emphasis on exploration and backtracking with the different locked doors and places where items belong. There's also a few hidden items and treasures here, nothing too brain-racking but noticeable if you scan the room carefully. With the many options that this room provides, I can't help but feel that this could have just been our only main hub, since it is possible to fit the angel busts and other doors into the main hall. Not only would the connecting rooms like the save room and hallway to the bell chamber fit here to create a more plentiful hub area, but it would also make relatively long treks back to the save room a lot shorter, while also making stalker encounters more common with the reduced space. The ground floor of the main hub contains one locked door, meanwhile there's 3 available up on the upper floor. One is locked from the other side, with a window giving you a long-term goal since it reveals one of the masks. The other is the wine room, a small room with a stand that requires an item, and the last is locked with a mask with an eye missing. Since our visit in the village already taught us that examining items allow us to interact with them, we can detach the maroon eye from the ring to unlock the door, which continues the more linear design of this part. The linear progression is a little disheartening at this point, but I can argue that the game makes the journey interesting enough with its upcoming combat scenarios and set pieces before it eventually opens up. Speaking of set pieces, the second we step through the door, we're ambushed by Castle Dimitrescu blocks your path into the main hall, forcing you to run through the unfamiliar halls in front of you. While this encounter is a fairly simple running away from the bad guy scenario, the game does a passable job at creating a distraction that could slow you down while giving you enough time to memorize aspects of this brief area. This distraction and thing to memorize is the locked Dimitrescu door at the end of the hallway that usually is the first thing to grab your attention when running away. It helps sell the panic-inducing situation despite how basic it is. After running through the unlocked door in the hallway, you escape through a hole in the wall and fall down into the tasting room, a seemingly unimportant route and brief area that can prove to be useful later in the level. With this downtime, it's best to finally discuss the Dimitrescu daughters as enemies. Cassandra, Bela, and Daniela Dimitrescu. 3 of the 4 designated stalker enemies of the castle who inhabit the main halls. While they don't necessarily stalk you like their mother and other previous stalkers, they do have a lot of attributes and mechanics that might as well make them stalker enemies. The best way to explain their mechanics is to combine classic Mr. X and classic Nemesis. Like Nemesis, they will appear in set locations depending on how much progress you've made in the castle, and like Mr. X, their range of locations they could access after appearing are very limited. Leaving to a safe area will make them disappear and stop them from appearing in that location. When pursuing you, they usually quickly fly towards you before grabbing you, and depending on their environment, they can also phase through certain objects and can block doorways. However, this is usually used in their scripted chases or boss fights. One very unexpected and rarely used mechanic is that they can call Alcina Dimitrescu to deal with you instead. The daughters are unkillable, and make it pretty apparent that combat with them is useless, since shooting at them makes them quickly advance towards you. However, if they receive enough damage, they will disappear for a second or two before reappearing. This trio are probably the most unpredictable and surprising enemies in the castle, and I believe this level of unpredictability of appearances does make up for their relatively easy chases. Even after playing through the game like 5 times, I've seen my friends find encounters with them that I never even knew existed. I didn't even know that they could even call Dimitrescu until my 4th playthrough. This is probably the daughter's greatest strength, still creating a sense of unease when exploring the castle. However, for their actual engagements, it's a really mixed bag. They are still very simple enemies, which means they are really easy to avoid, especially since encounters with them often occur near safe rooms. This is why good placement is needed, like in front of doors you want to access, for example. This has you deciding over risking health to avoid them or ammo to fend them off. This is probably the daughters at their mechanically best. However, the problem here is that not only are there enough situations like this, but there's just not enough encounters with them overall throughout the level. And I think a good way to deal with this downside is to just make them appear more often in more diverse areas like the dungeon or the other wings of the castle. Like trying to get Dimitrescu's lipstick, but before you enter the bathroom, a daughter appears at the top of the stairs, giving you the option to either avoid her, risk ammo, or potentially lose her in the Blood Cellar, which risks combat with the Moroica. So while the daughters have fair mechanics and a good sense of unpredictability that makes me wary whenever I explore the castle, they're really held back by how easy they are to avoid, their minimal use throughout the area, and lack of interaction with other enemies to create a fair challenge. After escaping Cassandra, you'll end up in the tasting room. This is where we see Alcina possessing a distinct wine bottle that you need for the wine room in the main hall. But before you can enter the room, she exits through a door behind her and locks it. This single door just makes me anxious, because this door is not important. You cannot open it, you cannot unlock it, and you can't get to the other side of it. Nothing. You could have just had Dimitrescu walking towards the dungeon, but no, leave me wanting more, keep things mysterious. I can't stand it. Though to be fair, it could have just been an area that was unfinished, or a small detail to make the room feel a little more alive. That doesn't mean there wasn't potential behind this door. It could have been a possible connector to another area of the castle or a completely new area altogether. After making our way deeper into the wine room, we enter the Hall of War, which introduces the physics-based torch puzzles. The fact that these are physics-based is probably why I spent way too much time trying to figure it out, since stuff like this isn't too common in Resident Evil games. Overall, it's really easy. Just hit the flame into the 2 torches and the door to the dungeon opens. It would have been more acceptable if this was just an introduction to future torch puzzles, but the other 2, obviously much better ones, are unfortunately optional. Here, we enter the dungeon, a drastic change in scenery with the disgusting imagery and growling noises in the distance. The dungeon does a really good job at ramping up the tension, with the darkness creating a claustrophobic feeling to these spacey hallways. The overall layout of the dungeon makes a nice and open-ended combat arena for your introduction with the Moroica. When it comes to some enemies in these games, it's really common to have even a single zombie be a challenge in some way, and I think this rings mostly true for the Moroica in this level. They're your typical zombie enemy with all the shambling, weapon wielding, and bullet sponginess. And yes, you heard me right, weapon wielding, but that aspect is honestly not all that important. The Moroica usually inhabit the dungeon and cellars of the castle. They attack with simple swipes and grabs, and they're also pretty quick, which does make headshots fairly tricky sometimes. This is mainly from their shambling and sudden stumbles, which brings some challenge to delivering bullets into their craniums. They could also be pretty unpredictable, like if you prefer shooting while blocking, they could follow up their attacks with a second hit if your attack doesn't falter them. I like their mechanics. It's what you expect, but they're done pretty well. In terms of bullet sponginess, it's honestly not that bad despite their health technically being greater than the Lycans. This may seem a little too much, but I find that it really balances them out with their relatively simple movement. On the other hand, what is new for this zombie-like enemy is their weapon wielding, which doesn't really change anything outside of the axe-wielding Moroica having better range with their attacks which you could dodge. On their own, the Moroica are significantly not as threatening as earlier enemies, but throughout the game they're used fairly well in combination with their environments and use of numbers. Most of the time you encounter these guys in the castle, you'll find them in packs to overwhelm you. In terms of environments, you'll find them being stuffed in small spaces or hallways, making it hard to avoid them while limiting movement during combat. It's typical zombie stuff all around, and that's probably why they aren't the most exciting enemy in the game, despite how fairly well made they are. They honestly don't have much going on with them outside of the challenge of landing headshots, which kind of removes the potential decision making of targeting specific body parts that they could have had. They have weapons, but it really doesn't change anything when engaging them in combat, which can get old compared to the unpredictability of later enemies. I believe a missed opportunity with these guys is the potential variety in weapon wielding. You could have ones with heavy weapons be slower but have significantly high damage and range. Meanwhile, the ones with sickles are fast and can attack quickly while also being able to throw their weapons. Or to be a little more creative, you could get hooked by a sickle-wielding Moroica and they can throw you into nearby packs of Moroica. Having something like this could add a lot more depth when engaging with these enemies, especially when it comes to using ammo wisely. You could knock the weapons out of their hands to make them less threatening, or you could focus on landing headshots to kill them quickly. But probably the biggest problem that these and a lot of other enemies have in the game is a huge lack of combination and working off of other enemies. It isn't a problem in the castle since not only are they introduced here, but the focus on combat in this level isn't as intense as compared to other areas in the game, so I don't think it's really the most important subject to bring up here. With these missed opportunities really dragging them down, the Moroica are well designed, yet not being the most exciting enemy in the game, though that doesn't mean they aren't used really well throughout this level. Despite the arena-esque layout of your first Moroica encounter, there's a good balance maintained between the classic careful engagement or avoiding enemies found in previous games, especially since ammo is scarce, your weapons are barely upgraded, and there's a lot of Moroica present here. Here, options are plentiful no matter which approach you take. When it comes to avoiding enemies, there are many open areas and cells to control enemy advancement. There's also a clear risk to avoiding enemies while still prioritizing item collection, since most items are found in cells where you could get easily cornered. Avoiding the waves of Moroica is simple, but getting caught is still easy, especially with some appearing in your way or hidden around corners to surprise you. Meanwhile, when it comes to combat options, the layout provides tons of approaches for dealing with these guys. Before you even meet your first Moroica, you get a fairly open room with barrels in the middle where you could lure out the first wave. With this, you could distance yourself and circle the room to avoid them or fight them. Further on in this encounter, there are two similar rooms to this one for the other waves. The large hallways also serve a good purpose in this decision. Here, the large groups of Moroica block progression, which makes avoiding them hard. but at the same time this can make them easy targets since they have less room to move around. Using the cells also makes them an easy target since you could funnel them through one at a time, or you can make them group up at the entrance for an easy shotgun or pipe bomb kill. Speaking of pipe bombs, one of the crates in the cells introduces us to this reliable weapon. They're your standard throwing explosive, but here with no recipes for these weapons, you only have a limited amount found throughout the level. The existence of it here not only gives you more options for this encounter combat-wise, but rewards careful exploration under the pressure of enemies present, especially since the Moroika appears underneath you when you grab it. On top of that, the fact that it's in limited quantity does a good job at making you think about how you use resources carefully. It's a good missable reward that builds off of the incentives introduced earlier in the level. Even enemy placement in this section is well thought out to create a challenge and reward careful play. The reveal of the first Moroika from the darkness in front of you grabs your attention immediately, but at the same time it distracts you from the one approaching you from the cells to your left. There's some good examples of Moroika hiding around corners that rewards careful traversal. This is also further tested with how you react to the number of enemies being thrown at you. Freaking out under pressure will get you hurt, and it's this distinction between calm and reckless which I believe embodies the way you approach decision making in any of these games. All this just pushes the player into a careful yet rewarding state of play, be it avoiding or combat. There's some nice environmental storytelling here as well, since killing one of the Moroika reveals that they possess the necklace of one of the people that was tortured down here, giving context to the list of names that you read about earlier. Overall, all these moving parts create a well thought out first encounter with these enemies that really ramp up the tension when it comes to decision making and engaging combat, something that's synonymous with the classic Resident Evil levels and the more action based Resident Evil games. After escaping the dungeon, we find ourselves face to face with a locked iron insignia door, yet another objective to remember in this constantly expanding level. It's a benefit of this linear house tour that we'll continue to go through. As we continue on, we'll find ourselves in a small room filled with cell bars, creating a simple and small maze. Here we're drawn to a breakable box in a small cell where we're ambushed by Bela Dimitrescu for an arguably better chase sequence compared to Cassandra's. Here the player is immediately shown that Bela can phase through the cell bars, already inducing a panic since Bela can easily close the gap in the confined pathways that restrict you. Despite how simple the layout of this room is along with the linearity of the chase, there's some decent environmental factors present to distract you, like a dead end with an item box or the run up the stairs seemingly presenting you with two different ways to go. The darkness and colors used in the room also kind of make the cell bars almost blend in with the environment. It helps create an uncertainty with traversal. It's a nice touch even if it wasn't intentional. For how better designed a chase sequence this encounter is, it still falls into some pitfalls of linear chase sequences, a still basic maze to run through, and just being too short in general. Also, despite how much more threatening Bela is here, she could still be a little too slow, which is noticeable on repeat playthroughs. Our chase brings us back to the ground floor of the castle and into a new room for our fight with Bela Dimitrescu. After breaking a window in a cutscene, Bela can now be damaged alongside losing her ability to phase through objects and fly. There isn't much strategy for attacking Bela, just shoot her until she dies like most Resident Evil bosses. In these mini-boss encounters, Bela and the rest of the Dimitrescu daughters act differently from their pursuing forms. In terms of movement, they'll be moving quickly, either to circle you or to quickly dash towards you for an attack. And they're aggressive with their attacks, which either will be a flurry of slashes that you can counter during to reduce damage, or the usual grab if you stick too close to them. They also have a very telegraphed lunge attack that gives you enough time to either falter or block them. Unlike Lycans or Moroika who could falter from shots hitting certain parts of their body, the Dimitrescu daughters can falter just from enough damage dealt anywhere. Their more aggressive moveset and speed creates a very fast and fun back and forth when it comes to swapping between defense and attack. This just really makes them engaging to fight. Overall, outside of some exceptions with Daniela, these Dimitrescu daughter mini-bosses all act the same in terms of combat. The difference comes with the scenarios of their encounters. This is something I really like, since it makes each encounter their own unique gimmick, which prevents these fights from getting stale. Bela is the simplest of these encounters since we need a fair introduction to the mechanics of the daughters. That means it unfortunately makes her the most underwhelming to fight, but it is necessary to fairly teach the player. The main focus here is just to directly fight her, so all you need to do is shoot her until she dies, but there's some talk to be had about the arena. It's a basic square-shaped room connected to a short hallway with a dead end. This is probably the least well-designed area for a fight like this. It's just too small for a hectic fight. There's also a small hallway that ends up reducing your movement options while trapping you in a small space for Bela to push you up against the walls. It's a little too punishing, especially for an introductory fight like this one. In my opinion, I think the best thing to do for a fight like this is to make the arena like Cassandra's. Fairly big, but with barrels in the middle to give you something to distance yourself and circle around. Luckily, there is a small exception of unique environmental interaction, the second window in the room. If you break it, it will guarantee a falter on Bela. It's a small and seemingly insignificant aspect of the fight, but it provides a small layer of strategy, like using it to falter Bela before she lunges at you. It's a shame something like this wasn't used in future fights. On top of that, this small detail doesn't really make up for the quality of this arena. It's just a very simple and enjoyable fight all around from its mechanics alone, but since it's used as an introduction for the other daughter fights, it falls short. After defeating Bela, a door unlocks into the kitchen, one of my favorite rooms when it comes to its looks and aesthetic. Unfortunately, it's not used much though. Here we recover the Sanguis Virginia, which is the bottle that we previously saw Alcina possess earlier in the tasting room. Small nitpick here, but for me there was some sort of anticipation to finding this item with it being in the hands of Alcina and all, and you just find it lying in a bucket of blood. It was kind of disappointing in my opinion. We then leave the kitchen into a hallway which contains an openable suitcase and another drawer that requires a lockpick. Opening the suitcase rewards you with a recoil compensator for your Lemmy. It's an attachment that will increase the gun's damage a little bit. While a nice reward after all you went through, I'm not a fan of having your first discoverable attachment being damage-based, especially since the game essentially hands you it. I would have liked it more if it was swapped with the high-capacity mag into Duke's shop, since higher damage would attract more attention compared to greater ammo capacity, which in turn makes purchasing decisions harder while pushing you to further explore for treasure. The magazine would also kinda be a reward for the Bela fight in a way, since her quickness would conflict with your slow reloading time. Thus, having greater ammo capacity would just reduce the times you need to reload. Continuing down the hallway, you get to your first lockpick. It's like it was fated for it to be so close to a locked drawer. After opening it, you receive a worthwhile treasure, and here is where I unfortunately go into another tangent. The reward for this drawer should have been relocated to the locked drawer you encountered in the bell chamber. Not only does it rewards memorization, but it would be a challenge to get to because now, Daniela ambushes you at that drawer, which gives you the impression that whatever is in that drawer is valuable. In reality, inside the bell chamber drawer is just ammo, which would have been a better reward in the kitchen drawer, especially since you would have used a lot of ammo to kill Bela and the Moroika. This placement will also give you a better idea that a majority of the locked drawers in the game contain ammo instead of valuable treasure like it is here. After collecting our upgrades and treasures, we then enter the dining room with a locked door leading to the courtyard, and an unlockable door leading back into the ground floor of the main hall. The looping level design gives you some good relief when traversing on top of providing another path into the dungeon for later. From here on out, it isn't too hard to figure out where to go next if you remembered the area. It's still very linear from here on out, though if you remembered the other locked drawer in the bell chamber, you do have an optional path to take, which leads to an encounter with Daniela. I do like her presence here. It just provides more decision making revolving around risking the drawer, or waiting until you eventually kill Daniela later in the level. Unfortunately, this is probably the only time Daniela appears as a pursuer. She definitely should have appeared in more places. By remembering the bottle slot in the wine room, you could place the Sanguis Virginia in the slot to receive the courtyard key. On your way back to the courtyard door, Cassandra will ambush you by blocking the dining room door. It's a well thought out encounter to test your quick decision making over risking health or ammo. After losing her in the dining room, we make our way to the other giant connecting room, the courtyard. Our first walk through here is to get us familiar with the layout before the latter half of the level, where knowledge of this room's layout is key. The center of the courtyard is pretty open, with the paths surrounding this open area being similar in size to the hallways at the castle. Some of these paths loop around or lead you back to the center, while one brings you to a dead end. To the left is another Dimitrescu door to remember. Meanwhile, to the right is an unlocked door leading us to the right wing of the castle. Here, we follow Alcina up the stairs and through the hallways where we hear her getting pretty pissed off at us.
What have you done to my daughter?
I wonder what we did. Here we get 2 Dimitrescu doors now. It's almost like the game is reminding us to remember where all these doors are because we're going to be getting their key soon. After collecting a map and a few items, we enter the Hall of Ablution. Here, we're gonna have to solve a puzzle. The room has a giant pool of blood in the center, surrounded by 4 statues. You could either turn left or right. In the back of the room, there's a riddle that you have to use to put the statues in the right position. The statues' positions are decided through an interpretation of the puzzle, by identifying the characters alongside specific details. Overall, this is a classic Resident Evil puzzle. The riddle is vague enough to where you sometimes question your interpretation of it, while getting you to look closely at the details of each statue close enough to make sense of it. However, it's easily victimized by the classic, "Oops, I accidentally solved the puzzle." It happens a lot in these games, but it's really easy to accidentally solve this one. It's really disappointing when it happens. After getting the statues to look in the right directions, the pool of blood drains, revealing a door back underground where our next combat encounter resides. Despite how linear item progression has been with the castle, its good factors at this point have mainly come from the atmosphere, sense of discovery, exploration to create a familiarity of the layout, and most importantly, the engaging enemy encounters. Those enemy encounters are important for this area to balance both the more action-heavy focus of the overall game with the more methodical and exploration focus of the castle that makes it unique from the other areas. The game does a good job with the use of enemies through putting them in well-designed rooms that both meld the combat arenas of Resident Evil 4 and classic Resident Evil environments. This basically gets you to engage the situation like you would in both games, from using your environment to gain an advantage over your enemies, to making the usual methodical decision-making in classic Resident Evil scenarios. And I believe the Blood Cellar best embodies this design. We return back to the underground for another combat encounter with the Moroika, and despite the similar aspects of the last encounter being present here, it definitely feels like an entirely different encounter. If you're going to create multiple combat encounters with an enemy you're going to use a lot, then it's best to make most of them unique in some way so engaging them doesn't get dull while still retaining a challenge. The Blood Cellar is already unique from the overall aesthetic alone. The intimidating red glow and the blood that floods the halls already ramps up the tension, while also further reflecting the disgusting and oppressive nature behind the Dimitrescu family. Unlike the relatively open and linear dungeon, the Blood Cellar adopts very oppressive tight corridors to create a more maze-like arena. It really gives off the feeling of encountering a single enemy in the tight hallways of the Spencer Mansion, where avoiding is a difficult risk to take. The overall samey feeling of the place really gives you the impression of getting lost or being unaware of your location really well, especially when under the pressure of multiple enemies. In combination with the long and tight hallways, there are more open areas present with the usual clutter in the center to distance and circle enemies. It not only fits the more enclosed theme of this area, but it's a natural evolution of difficulty in this level. When going through the first time, you're expecting enemies waiting for you around the many corners of this place, but the game makes it apparent that you can't even trust the ground you're walking on as it shows sleeping Moroika fall into the blood below. It's a good way of creating uncertainty while establishing the ambushing mechanic unique to this room. If you heed the game's warning, you'll notice the bubbles appear from the blood below before Moroika ambushes you. While the 2 times this happens are scripted and predictable in future runs, it's still very effective. It further pushes the idea of slow and careful play when under pressure, while rewarding observant players. 2 good lessons taught you previously in this level and are tested here. The game knows well that a smaller enemy count is best in a more tight environment to prevent you from being too overwhelmed while still making you feel outnumbered and pressured. Your first encounter with the Moroika is a single one that ambushes you, both to surprise and prepare you for encounters in these spaces. When in more open areas, the game throws more enemies at you, which blocks progression forward, pushing you to use environmental details like the open spaces to circle them, or the shelf to block them. This is followed by another ambush further down that punishes you for panicking and not carefully scanning your surroundings. The area concludes with around 3 or 4 enemies coming from both the open area and the tight corridor that leads to the exit. These encounters already make combat avoiding more challenging, but still fair with the different options you have in this area. The tight corridors are a blessing in disguise as enemies become easy targets and can be funneled through for effective shotgun blasts. This, and knocking them back, can be effective for creating openings for you to progress. Luring them to more open areas can make hallways safe for traversal, or can help you gain more space and distance for combat. Using the shelf can either line up Moroika for easy shots while keeping you safe, or will distract them long enough to use the second corridor to circle them. The second ambush and final Moroika before the elevator blocks your path and puts pressure on you to act. Do you risk combat, or try and bait an attack to give yourself a chance to run past? What about the weapon you use? You may have more pistol ammo to use, but it won't guarantee a stun like a shotgun would. These are your decisions to make. All of this further emphasizes the classic risks you would take between health and resources in the older games, while creating an open-ended and engaging combat encounter like the more action-packed games. On top of that, the situation feels different depending on your approach overall. You can make it panic-inducing when quickly weaving between enemies, or you can make it a methodical traversal if you decide to carefully kill each enemy as they appear. This balance between classic and action is probably best felt here. Even with the linear item progression, I find that the game is still providing the engaging decision-making that comes from any other game in the series. The Blood Cellar comes to a close with a quick elevator ride up to a balcony on the second level of the right wing. Being outside the castle, looming above locations where you once were, it really gives you a moment of relief and empowerment, almost as if you were climbing up in the world after going through the worst. Here, there's a weirdly placed safe room that's only used here for the upcoming encounter. Funny story, but I decided to skip this room in my first run, and had no idea what was in there. So because I couldn't access it from Dimitrescu's private chambers, I ran all the way through the Blood Cellars again and was pretty disappointed to find just the safe room. Yeah, that one's definitely on me. We continue down the porch where we come across Dimitrescu in her private chambers talking with her boss. We get some character building with her trying to maintain her composure when talking, to then having a little rage moment when alone. We also get a sense of her motherly dedication when she ignores her boss's wishes for revenge over the death of her daughter. After she leaves, we go into her chambers where we get even more character building through her diary. Here we see the more entitled, jealous, and whiny older sibling side of her, which is appropriate since the dark interior of this castle properly reflects her more negative feelings underneath her appearance. A small gripe with this section is how you access it. The small wooden bridge that you cross to the private chamber porch breaks, preventing you from looping back to the save room and Blood Cellar. I honestly wish there should have been a loop here just to be more forgiving with the save room, and a potential path to take when avoiding Dimitrescu and her daughters when they're chasing you. Back in the private chambers, we finally get the Dimitrescu key. So that's why we've been seeing a lot of Dimitrescu doors before we got here. Stuff like that is a nice reminder to the player to keep their locations in mind, because soon, that linear item progression is no longer going to be with us. After unlocking the Dimitrescu door back into the right wing hallway, Dimitrescu herself emerges and slams us back underground into a new area. We go through a room full of pillars that create a small maze, especially with the cell bars creating walls in between those pillars. The size and intricacies of this room tips you off that something is going down here soon. And soon is now, because when you try to open up that gate to the next room, Dimitrescu appears again, makes your right hand come off, and begins to pursue you. I guess now's the time to talk about Alcina Dimitrescu as the designated stalker enemy of the castle. This overall trend of having a stalker enemy in these recent Resident Evil games have been highlights of the series for me. There's always a joy to have in my opinion, despite how some can see them as a little overused. Dimitrescu will appear halfway through the castle section and will roam the main halls, courtyard, and both wings of the castle looking for you in the style of Jack, Marguerite, and remake Mr. X. She could also appear in certain set locations whenever you make a certain amount of progress in the level. She's not the fastest and will be slowed down by doors, but her reach with her attacks have a pretty long range, but are relatively slow and never come in succession. She can also push you back whenever you try to run past her, but the chances of that happening are unbelievably slim. All in all, Dimitrescu does what a good stalker enemy does through her mechanics alone, but tends to fail a lot in some aspects. For the good, her range of rooms she can access are much greater than her daughter's, and that opens up a lot of unscripted encounters to throw you off your exploration of the castle. And while only pertaining to a few rooms, the Moroica can be in her presence to create some very tense but fair encounters at times. These encounters with the Moroica and in very small spaces work well with her slow yet long range of attacks, which can really do some damage, especially on harder difficulties. However, while Dimitrescu takes some steps forward compared to Jack's and Marguerite's mechanics, she also takes a lot of significant steps back. It cannot be denied how slow she is when it comes to her movement and attacks. It creates a lot of situations where you could just easily run past her. The way some of the rooms are designed to be very open doesn't help this flaw either. It's fine to have something like this. Jack was more of a direct threat as an enemy, while remake Mr. X was more of a moving wall to pressure you. And while Dimitrescu seems to be designed more off the latter, she still falls flat because it was the combination with enemies that made Mr. X an effective threat. She still has enemies in her presence that do create some tense encounters, but it's only 1 or 2 rooms, while most of the time, the enemy placement and numbers don't really challenge your traversal on top of that. Dimitrescu really would have retained more of a challenge with more enemies scattered around the castle, especially in more small and tight rooms. This allows her to keep her mechanics but become more of a threat as an enemy that pressures you to make hard decisions when traversing the castle. It also wouldn't have hurt her to follow you into more locations, like the dungeon and rooftops where the room layout and presence of enemies would accommodate her presence. One last missed opportunity is changing up her mechanics the more daughters you kill. In-game, you could definitely hear her growing frustration the longer you progress, but that seems to only be reflected in her dialogue rather than in gameplay. With each dead daughter, you could have had her grow as an individual threat, either by increasing her speed, having her perform different kinds of attacks, or disregard environmental aspects that could block her, like tables. I think this is a missed opportunity not only when it comes to challenge, but in terms of uniqueness and mechanics to make her stand out from other recent stalkers. So while Dimitrescu has the design and presence all stalker enemies need and strive for, she's greatly held back by her slowness and lack of use with both enemies and the environment to create a significant challenge or sense of pressure like previous stalkers. Back to the current game, with our right hand stuck to the lever of the door, we now have lost the ability to attack and heal entirely, all while being pursued by Dimitrescu throughout this maze. It's all a great deal of tension as damage can no longer be reversed. It does a good job at tension while making you be as careful as possible to not get hit by utilizing the environment you memorized to your advantage. Using the environment to distance yourself from Dimitrescu is simple but a great tool to not only teach you her mechanics, but a decent test on your use of the game's environment previously learnt with the Moroika encounters. While it is easy to avoid her, the game does throw a curveball where Dimitrescu can slice through cell bars. In the moment, this gets you to rethink your path through the maze while providing more paths for you to traverse. If you grab your hand and pull the lever, you'll have to wait for the gate to open up entirely before you could leave. It's a good tension-filled moment. Running into the next room leads you into a hallway where Dimitrescu could block you off by making a shortcut, through destroying a set of cell bars in front of you. It's surprising, but unfortunately it is really easy to just run back into the previous room and use the entrance she just made. As you continue to run through the hallway, you come to another Dimitrescu door with another tension-filled moment, and a small mechanic I haven't mentioned yet. Whenever you use a key to open up a door, there's a small animation where you use your psychic abilities to insert the key into the door and unlock it. It's fairly long enough to create a sense of panic, especially when you want to unlock a door while being chased by enemies. This encounter is fairly straightforward and a nice introduction to how Dimitrescu operates, but unfortunately despite the more enclosed space here, she is still noticeably sluggish and easy to circle around, even with cell bars blocking potential paths for you to take. After running through the door, we collect our first mask, the Mask of Sorrow, which activates a giant elevator that helps us return back up to the surface while escaping Dimitrescu for the time being. From here on out, Castle Dimitrescu has now opened up for the best. I've definitely talked a lot about my mixed feelings on the linearity of the castle up until now, especially when it comes to item progression. The idea of linear progression just feels wasted on an area teeming with potential from previous areas in the series. This feeling also goes for a few other aspects of the game, like the lack of meaningful saves on higher difficulties, the placement of safe rooms, and the lack of item boxes overall, which honestly would be weirdly implemented with certain areas later in the game, especially due to their differentiating level designs. I mean, imagine how annoying it would be to constantly run back and forth to an item box in Beneviento or Morose areas as they are now. But for all the negative feelings that come to the first half of the castle, I find that the melding of classic and action in combat and the sense of exploration is what makes this an engaging portion of the level. And despite how relatively short some of these sections were, they were memorable enough to keep me engaged and aware of the many details in this level for the future. And now, the exploration that made you familiar with the layout of this place, I believe pays off with the second half of the castle. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to end things here, and make this whole analysis thing a two-parter. I'm not sure how much more my computer can take with how long this video already is. I'm already worried if it's even possible for me to upload something this big. Not only that, but I definitely need a break before I tackle the next part of this level. Everything up until now has been fun, but it's definitely taken a toll on me. I can't promise a part 2 soon, but I'll try my hardest to make it happen, especially since my plans with college are really gonna interfere with its production. Overall, I'm just really ecstatic about this video. It's a lot of effort for my first one, and I honestly hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. It's unclear how well this is gonna do, but if I find that it does well in my eyes, I'm definitely open to making more videos on level design and aspects of game series that I love. Talking more about Resident Evil, Metal Gear, the Souls games, or other media would be very fun. You can follow me on Twitter, where I mainly post my art and occasionally talk about manga I love. And that's about it. Have a good one.